It's truly a pleasure to rise and to address and to put my full support behind Bill 204. And I must say I'm quite astounded with the discussion that's going on and the excuses that are being used on why someone or this government doesn't want to be fiscally responsible. You know, it wasn't that long ago I was sitting in this, a little less than a year ago, I was sitting in this legislature listening to the so-called PC Fiscal 4. It's obvious that there are no more. There hasn't been one government member who stood up to speak on fiscal responsibility, but there are 4 fiscally responsible individuals in the Wild Rose Caucus. Right. It's interesting how people's attitude speak out and want to spend other people's money. And this is the case. This government, at today's discussion, seems to appear that they want to spend other people's money, and by no situation should they be restrained in any way, that they should have a free ability to spend as they want. It's also interesting the amount of I want to say gossip, or not even gossip, that is being thrown out there by this government about a PST. I think that maybe what the confusion is the finance minister says today we're not going to have a provincial sales tax, but I think what the PST stands for from the PC caucus is the provincial spending theme. And that's what they're continuing to talk about, is their spending theme and how much money they want to spend. But it isn't about having the freedom to spend money when all of these so-called emergencies arise. What it is, it's about the discipline of being able to prioritize and spend the amount of money that you have. And that's why this is so important. And it's interesting, and I guess actually what it really is sad when you look around the number of jurisdictions in the world, countries and states, that so-called fiscally responsible, but yet they couldn't restrain their spending and they ran into deficits, so then they voted, just as this government did a few years ago when they paid off the debt and they're going to run their first, what would I say, they want to not save their money. They passed a new law saying that all surplus dollars will no longer have to go into savings all of a sudden because their debt was paid off. And this again goes back to reflect on the situation. But the most important thing is if we really want the Alberta advantage, if we want to spur on and have a strong economic growth, we have to constrain our spending. Right. We're in a $7 billion plus cash deficit this year alone. The infrastructure that they talk about wanting to build, the rate that we're spending is not sustainable. And in 2 or 3 short years, we're going to see this government create, mind you, they won't be here that long, so I guess we won't have to look at that problem. But they're going to create another crisis because they're going to have to cut back on the infrastructure spending because it's not sustainable. And so what you really want of a strong economy is a sustainable budget. And that's what this is about. You get into that, you prioritize, you spend your money accordingly, and you don't have that problem. It's also interesting to me when this government continues to speak against this, when the biggest problem are growth and population and inflation, this bill would actually help such areas as Fort McMurray and Airdrie address their population and corporate growth, which this government refuses to recognize. And so it would actually turn the table and address those problems. But the reality is that government is no different than people. It's just that it's not held accountable like people are on a short-term basis. They have this ability to continue to borrow money, spend money. But the fact of the matter is, if we look at areas like Greece, France, California, many areas like that that have got a major deficit, they aren't fiscally responsible, and the amount of dollars that they have to spend to service their debt is unacceptable, and they can't get out of that hole. And that's why you want to restrain that. And the other interesting thing, though, when you actually restrain it to population plus inflation, is that as your economy grows, there is actually more, and this government finally learned that with the new royalty framework. If they reduce taxes, they would increase their revenue, not reduce it. And it's the same here. If we were to actually reduce the spending, in the next year you'd actually have more because you'd have economic growth. And all of the debate, all of the points they're bringing up are very shallow, short-term excuses on saying we don't want to be disciplined, we don't want to be restrained, we want to be able to buy votes on a minute's notice, to be able to just throw out a new project, spend $2 billion on whether it's CO2 or $15 billion on power lines that we don't need. They don't want any restraint, and so this bill would upset their plans, again their provincial spending theme or their PST, to buy themselves a new mandate from the people, but it's not going to work, Mr. Speaker. It just isn't going to happen. What we need to do, and why this bill is so important, it's about setting priorities as a family. Every family has to be fiscally responsible. We're a family here in the province of Alberta. We need to be fiscally responsible. Restraining the spending is critical if we want to bring back the Alberta advantage. At the current rate of spending, I'm very grateful that we had that winning windfall of revenue from the oil and gas business in 2006, 7, and 8, halfway through 8, but that's gone. And this current spending, the increase is unbelievable. Just this last year, I believe it was a 16% increase for health care, and yet the results have not been, well, abysmal, as my good colleague from Calgary Fish Creek points out. It's just sad. And so to think that spending money is going to solve our problems, it doesn't do it. You need to have the restraint in there. We need to have the accountability where we sit down with our budget. And it's always amazing to me, too, is how the budget immediately talks about we're not going to have health care, we're not going to have education. No, it's other areas that we don't have. We don't need to spend $2 billion to pump plant food into the earth and claim that we don't have any money now for health care. We don't need to spend $15 billion on power lines that, looking back, was necessary. But today we don't need to have big coal power plants or a nuclear facility hundreds of or thousands of miles away and put in a power line. And so what we have is a priority problem of where we want to designate the tax dollars. We have a spending problem on where we're going to spend those tax dollars. And if we don't acknowledge our problems, we're going to continue to have to pay an extraordinary price that we can't afford when we look back. And that's the key of all of this, is when are we going to really look at the true facts and realize the problems that we're facing. We have a huge infrastructure problem. There's no question about that. How are we addressing it? We hear over and over and over again about a 20-year plan, but yet that plan has not been tabled. It's not evident to Albertans. It doesn't say Highway 63 to Fort McMurray or Highway 3 to Medicine Hat. It just says we have a plan. But there is nothing that's been presented to the people of Alberta. What a real plan would be is say, here's the Fiscal Responsibility Act, here's what we're going to spend, and now here with our infrastructure, if we have $6 billion this year, these are the projects that will be addressed first. But that's a plan, is to actually have the proposal written down where people can see, where people can debate, and it can be changed openly, not at the tweet of some minister who wants to change things. And another problem that we're facing, because this government continues to say, oh, we're not running a deficit, you know, oh no, we've got the cash in the bank. We do for this year. Nobody debates that. But what about the unfunded liabilities that we have? It wasn't that long ago that this government signed a contract with teachers for 5 years, I believe it was January 08, saying, here's the 5-year funding, and we're hearing this about health now. Here's the 5-year funding, but it wasn't even 2 years into there where they wouldn't accept their own rules and contracts that they wrote. But they spent an extra $2 billion of taxpayers' money because they failed to pay their original 2/3 that they owed those teachers. And so in order to bring them back on side, they say, well, we'll pay the last third. And those are unacceptable. That's where if you were limited to inflation plus population growth, you couldn't make these type of deals and be held unaccountable. But once again, it's always about using other people's money. This government needs to be personally responsible. We need to balance our budget. We can prioritize and spend properly and address the growth in the areas that we need. It's about prioritizing properly, not by saying we're limited to the amount of money that we can and will spend. That flexibility is there. It's just whether we have the discipline or not to follow our spending and to prioritize it in a way that best meets the needs of the taxpayers.